All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about one of the most incredible endings in all of history. See, when the Buddha was 80 years old, frail and close to death, he didn't just fade out. No, he put a deliberate and frankly brilliant plan into action to make sure his teachings would survive for millennia. This is the story of his final blueprint, a blueprint for a legacy. You know, it's a question that every movement, every company, every single nation has to face eventually. How do you make an idea last forever? Well, the Buddha's final months are basically a masterclass in how to do just that. So let's dive in. So you might think a story about the Buddha would start with meditation or some deep spiritual question, right? Nope. This one starts with a military problem. There's this powerful king, Ajatasattu, and he wants to conquer his neighbors, the Vajji people. But before he launches an attack, he sends his top minister to ask the Buddha a very practical question. Can I win? And this one political question becomes the perfect setup for the Buddha to deliver his final and maybe most important teachings on how to build something that lasts. So instead of a simple yes or no, the Buddha does something much smarter. He turns to his assistant Ananda and asks, "Hey, are the Vajji people still following those 7 principles I taught them ages ago?" And these weren't some mystical secrets, they were just principles of a strong society. You know, meet up often, work together, respect your traditions, honor your elders. The Buddha explains that as long as they follow these rules, they're basically unbeatable. The minister got the message loud and clear. An attack would be a very bad idea. And this is where the genius of his plan really kicks in. Right after that meeting, the Buddha gathers his own followers, his monks, and gives them their own 7 principles. And look at this. They're a direct parallel to the political ones. Meeting to discuss state affairs becomes meeting to study scripture. Upholding laws becomes respecting the monastic rules. He's showing them that the exact same things that make a nation strong will make their spiritual community last long after he's gone. It's a blueprint for resilience. Okay, so now that he's laid down this foundation for his followers, the story pivots. It moves from the Buddha as this public figure and advisor to the very personal story of a man facing his own end. And he gets really real about it. He's not some abstract divine figure here. He's 80. He talks about the pain in his aging body, comparing it to a rickety old cart, just barely held together that could fall to pieces at any moment. He knows his time is almost up. And then he makes the announcement. But notice, he doesn't say he's dying. He says that he is choosing the moment of his final passing. He declares that in exactly 3 months, he will enter what's called Parinirvāṇa, the final nirvana. The moment he says this, the texts say the entire world shakes. And his closest disciple, Ananda, who's been with him for decades, is just completely shattered. You can just feel his grief. To him, the unthinkable is happening. The light of the world is about to go out. But even in all this chaos, the Buddha is perfectly calm. He uses Ananda's terror as a teachable moment. He explains that earthquakes aren't just random, chaotic events. He says they're tied to these huge cosmic spiritual milestones, like the birth of a Buddha or his enlightenment. He's reframing his own death not as a tragedy, but as a natural, predictable part of a grand cosmic plan. So this brings us to the absolute core of his legacy project. In these final weeks, the Buddha lays out a crystal clear set of instructions for how his community is going to work when he's no longer there. And this is probably the most crucial part. He tells his followers, don't look for a new leader to replace me. He tells them to rely on only 2 things, themselves and his teachings, the Dharma. He's basically saying the teachings are the leader now. It's an absolutely brilliant move that decentralizes all the power and makes the community totally self-reliant. And it's really important to get what he's actually aiming for here. This parinirvāṇa, it isn't just death as we think of it. The words mean something like the final extinguishing, like blowing out the flame of suffering for good. It's the complete exit from that whole cycle of birth and death. It's the ultimate destination. And he didn't just leave them with abstract ideas. He left behind a practical, step-by-step toolkit. This is the famous 8-fold path. It's the how-to manual for anyone who wants to follow his instructions and reach that goal he was talking about. Okay, the teachings have been delivered. The blueprint is complete. And now, in his final hours, we get to see how it all plays out. I mean, get this. Even on his deathbed, he's not done working. This wandering philosopher, Subatsada, Here's the Buddha's about to pass away and rushes to see him, full of questions. The Buddha's disciples try to turn him away, to give their master some peace, but the Buddha overhears and insists on seeing him. He spends some of his very last moments answering the man's questions until he too finds enlightenment. Incredible. Then he turns to his monks for the very last time. And his final message is so simple but so powerful. It's a universal truth and a personal command all in one. Everything that is created eventually falls apart. Everything. So because of that, you have to work tirelessly for your own liberation. Don't waste a single second. And with that, he doesn't just die. This isn't a medical event. He consciously moves his mind through these incredibly deep, focused states of meditation, showing complete mastery of his mind right up to the final moment. It's his last silent teaching. The scriptures say that even the gods who were watching this all unfold remarked on it. And they weren't just sad. They understood the profound lesson he embodied, that even the greatest being in the world is still subject to this universal law of impermanence. But believe it or not, the story doesn't end with his final breath. In fact, what happens next is what solidifies his legacy in the physical world. And it nearly starts a war. See, before he died, the Buddha left some very specific instructions. He told his followers he was not to be cremated like an ordinary monk, but like a wheel-turning king, a legendary universal emperor. This was a huge deal. It positioned him not just as a spiritual teacher, but as a major world historical figure. And this high status immediately created a massive problem. After he was cremated, his physical remains, his relics, became the most sought-after things in the entire world. 8 different kingdoms actually sent their armies, fully prepared to go to war just to get a piece of their teacher. Just as a war was about to break out, a wise Brahmin stepped in. And, using the Buddha's own ideas about harmony, he proposed a simple solution. He carefully divided the relics into 8 equal shares. This brilliant act of diplomacy meant the Buddha's physical presence could spread peacefully across the land, with monuments built over them that became centers of worship for centuries. So in the end, when you step back and look at it, the Buddha's blueprint worked on every single level. He created a code of conduct for the community, a clear path for the individual, and even a physical legacy for the world to share. He proved that for a movement to outlive its founder, it needs more than just a powerful memory. It needs a plan. Which kind of makes you wonder, right? What ideas today are truly being built to last?